Welcome to the Practical NLP Podcast with me, Andy Smith. This week we discover how to utilize an existing strategy, how to change a strategy that isn't working, and how to design and install a new strategy from scratch. We also find out the strengths and weaknesses of the different representational systems when used as steps in a strategy, what each one is good for and what they're not so good at. So, you've elicited somebody's strategy. Now, what can you do with it? The first thing you could do is utilize it. If you've elicited the decision-making strategy that someone goes through when they're buying something, what that tells you is the order in which they like to gather information. So if you're selling cars, if you find out how a customer bought their last car in the course of chatting with them, then as long as they liked that last car, you'd aim to guide them through the same strategy to buy one of yours. If you find that they liked the look of the car, then read up about it, then came into the showroom to see it up close and had a test drive that gave them a good feeling about the car, you wouldn't give them the brochure and a load of technical information and then send them away. If they've come into the showroom, they've already gathered as much of that information as they need. What they want now is to get their hands on the car for a test drive. Make it easy for them to reach their decision by giving them the information they need in a way that suits their strategy. If you give them the information in any other order, it jars with their strategy and makes it harder for them to decide. Plus the experience will feel wrong to them, making it more likely that they'll bail out. I'm not saying that they will definitely buy the car. It still has to meet their criteria, but you've made it easier for them to decide they want it. It's the same principle for motivation strategies, learning strategies, and any other strategy. Okay, changing strategies and strategy design. If one of your strategies isn't getting the outcome you want, you can change it. Remember, the strategy is working perfectly for getting the outcome that you're getting. So if you don't like the outcome, change the strategy and you'll get a different outcome. We'll look at ways of changing a strategy in a moment, but first let's consider some principles to give the change the best chance of working. First of all, your new strategy should still follow the TOTE model in its structure. It still needs the first test or trigger to start it off. It still needs some sequence of operations, a second test to tell it whether to stop or do some more, and an exit so that you can stop doing the strategy at some point. The second principle is to keep it simple. The change should be as small as you can make it to still get the result. This is for reasons of ecology. The bigger the change, the more likely you are to get unwanted or unforeseen side effects, which could cause other problems. Let's imagine someone whose strategy for buying books leads to them spending loads of money that they can't afford, while their bookshelves are already groaning under the weight of books they haven't yet read. Now, they could convert to some religion that's against the buying of books, but the chances are their friends, family, and employers might not like all the other effects of such a radical change. Wouldn't it be easier to add a little AD step into their book buying strategy that asks, how many unread books have I got already? That only changes the book buying strategy and leaves the rest of their life undisturbed. The third principle ties in with keeping it simple. Intervene before the strategy goes wrong. It's a lot easier to prevent problems than to try and clear them up after they've happened. Fourthly, make sure it uses all three of the main rep systems, V, A, and K, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Different rep systems are useful for accessing different kinds of information. If one rep system is missing, you'll probably miss some relevant information. For example, the seafood diet, where they see food and they eat it, is not a great strategy for deciding what to eat. There's only one step in the operate stage, visual external. Much better to have a kinesthetic internal step where you check if you're actually hungry, and maybe an AD where you ask, do I really want this? Fifth, if there are any elements of the strategy that put the person into a suboptimal state, perhaps an unpleasant or critical internal dialogue in a motivation strategy so that the person feels lousy, reframe those elements or change their submodalities. When people feel bad, they can't access all of their resources, so they won't perform as well. Find a way of making the strategy work without the bad feelings so that they can get the result they want and perform better because they're feeling good. Finally, make sure there's an exit after a certain period of time or a certain number of times around the loop, even if the criteria in the second test aren't met. If that fail-safe mechanism wasn't there, a person could go out shopping for a particular item of clothing, and if they don't find it, they'd never come back. So you would add a step that exits the strategy after 3 hours, or 5 shops visited, or whatever numbers will work for them. So, how do we change a strategy? Here are some ways. Rehearse the new strategy with eye-accessing cues. Take the person through each step of the new strategy, getting them to move their eyes to the appropriate direction to access the rep system of each step. Dissociated state rehearsal. Have the person see themselves doing the new strategy, then stepping into the picture and rehearsing it associated. Then try it out for real. We'll be trying out a pattern called the New Behavior Generator that does exactly this in a later podcast. Reframing. Sometimes you can leave the sequence of steps as they are, but reframe the content to make the strategy work better. Someone might have a strategy for cold calling that doesn't work very well and causes them to feel bad and want to give up after the first no they receive, because they're framing it as a rejection. So if you know that there's 10 no's for every yes, reframing the no as being one step closer to getting a yes will lead to a positive kinesthetic rather than a negative kinesthetic. Submodality changes. Again, this leaves the sequence of steps intact, but makes a change to how an individual step is represented to get a better result. I had a client once who came to see me with presentation anxiety. It was important to him to sort this out because presentations were a big part of his job. His strategy for preparing for an important presentation was to run mental movies of everything that could go wrong, one after another, the aim being to prepare himself so that he could deal with any glitches. He was running these movies in an associated way so that he was seeing it as if through his own eyes. Not surprisingly, the more of these he ran, the more fearful he became, and the less he felt like going anywhere near preparing his presentations until he was forced to by the even greater fear of the looming deadline. It was a great strategy for producing not very good presentations and getting to feel bad about it in advance. It seemed like stopping all that and mentally rehearsing success instead was a step too far for him at that time, so I got him to run his problem rehearsals as dissociated movies, seeing himself dealing calmly and resourcefully with whatever problems might occur. It took down the anxiety to a level where he was able to handle it and prepare earlier. Metaphor. You can tell a story which guides the listener through a series of steps analogous to the steps of the revised strategy. Anchoring. Chaining anchors is a really straightforward way of changing a strategy, and probably the one I would go for most times. Start by anchoring all the steps of the existing strategy. If you want to insert a new step, anchor that as well. Then chain the anchors in the new sequence, putting the new step in at the point where you want it. If you want to take a step out of the strategy, just miss that step out of the chain. Go from the step before it straight to the step after it. And of course, there's the old-fashioned way of rehearsal and practice. Rehearse, drill, and practice the new strategy until it becomes automatic. Let's talk about installing a strategy. Sometimes a person just doesn't have a strategy for achieving a particular outcome, so you can help them install a new strategy. If you're designing a new strategy from scratch, all of the design principles for changing strategies that we've already talked about still apply. So, where do you get your new strategy from? Well, you could make one up that you think could work. Or you could check your own strategy for achieving that outcome to see if it's applicable. It may not be, because the other person is not you. They may not have the same quality of information that you have because of your experience or your capabilities. John Grinder has talked about Virginia Satir advising her students to go with their gut feeling to know what to do with a client. As John points out, that's great if your gut feeling is as reliable as Virginia Satir's, but for someone without decades of experience to base their gut feeling on, it could lead to the wrong decision. So if you want to install your own strategy, make sure it's appropriate for that person. Or you could model someone else who has a good strategy and use that. Again, make sure it's appropriate for the person you're installing it in. You need to calibrate their responses as you install it to pick up any signs of incongruity. And how do you install it? Well, you can use some of the methods that you already know about from changing strategies: rehearsal, metaphor, or installing an anchor chain. Let's talk about rep system characteristics. As components in a strategy, different representational systems are good for different things. One of the ways that strategies can go wrong is by representing experience in a rep system that's not suited to it. We'll see this in a later podcast when we go into the spelling strategy. The first thing to say is that an experience is best represented by the sensory system that corresponds to it. So you're always going to get more information about a painting, say, by having a picture of it rather than a feeling about it. Digital experience, usually in the form of words, is always secondary, so it contains less information than the sensory experience that it's describing. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Auditory digital internal dialogue, in everyday human language, is useful for planning, for putting labels on experience, for summarizing, and for making sense of things. Remember that the more attention you pay to internal dialogue, the less you have available for tracking sensory experience. Whole schools of personal development, like the inner game, are based on this idea. Auditory tonal, what something sounds like. This can add emotional impact to internal dialogue or sound and motivate or demotivate accordingly. Visual is the fastest system and can contain a huge amount of information in an instant. It can allow you literally to see the big picture or zoom in on details. Moving pictures are better than still pictures for seeing consequences and predicting what could happen in the future. Visual is useful for making decisions because you can compare two or more options as pictures. This will be very hard to do with words, feeling, or sounds. Auditory processing, whether tonal or digital, is sequential. One word or note or sound follows another, so it's slower than visual. Kinesthetic is slower still and has more inertia. Trying to change a feeling without using visual or auditory systems is like turning a tank around. Emotions, or kinesthetic meta as they're sometimes known in the NLP jargon, are the main way that we evaluate experience. Unlike the primary kinesthetic sensations of proprioception, knowing where each part of your body is in relation to others, balance, and touch, they are responses to internal or external events as processed through our mental filters, and can be a response to remembered or constructed representations in other modalities as well as to primary experience. So you can change or create emotional responses through, for example, anchoring, submodality shifts, or reframes. That's it for this week's podcast. Next time we'll examine what works and what doesn't work in motivation strategies, buying strategies, and decision strategies. As ever, you can find the show notes for this podcast at nlppod.co.uk. And you can also do yourself a favor by signing up for the Coaching Leaders newsletter to get practical tips, how-tos, and book reviews at coachingleaders.co.uk. See you next time.